Welcome. At last year's THWACKcamp, we sat down with SolarWinds CTO Joël Dolacy to talk about ways that IT professionals could level up their skills when it comes to getting new software and hardware to help us do our job better. We focused on the issues that motivate business leaders to make decisions on how IT pros can speak to those motivations.
And we wanted to keep that line of conversation going by focusing on another area that can be a disconnect, and that's especially how to get areas of the company outside of IT, whether that's management or other technical teams, to understand the value that monitoring brings to the table.
So, joining us today in this discussion is my fellow head geek, Patrick Hubbard, along with another familiar face in the SolarWinds community, Rob Hock. After 6 years at SolarWinds, Rob transitioned to Vyopta as their director of product management.
G'day, everyone.
Yeah, well, we are really happy to have you here. You're still hugely popular on THWACK, and not just because they like Rob Boss, but we thought that you'd be a great guest for this session because much like the Stig, the tame racing driver, you are sort of a tame IT executive.
You never saw me in my prime.
Well, right, but you can't seem to stay away from monitoring, even though you've spent time on both sides of the fence. For example, now you're managing the product team for Vyopta, right?
Yep, that's correct. So Vyopta is a cloud-based solution to monitor your video conferencing infrastructure. So we provide monitoring and analytics around your endpoints and MCUs, bridges, and soup to nuts.
Multi-product, one view.
Single pane of glass.
Exactly, sounds familiar. But before that, you were a superstar in IT here at SolarWinds for a long time. And then you left and became the director of IT for Sparefoot. And what was interesting about that was you went from being in IT and products over to the other side of being the executive who had to juggle all the technology decisions for technology buying, manage the teams, and then translate all of that into something that the C-level executives could understand.
That's correct. I became very versed in buzzwords and fixing coffee.
Right. Okay, so again, what we want to do is help the viewers understand what's going on in the minds of management and also external technical teams when we're talking about monitoring to make it matter to them as more than just, this extra thing that they don't know what's going on. So I think the first thing I'd like to do is really frame up the issues that are at hand. From the technical standpoint, I believe that there's a view from technical teams, again, application developers or specific silo teams, that monitoring is noise, that it really can destabilize the system, that your thing actually is what pushed over my thing, or that you, the monitoring folks, couldn't possibly understand the special snowflake that is my area of effect. So, I mean, is that accurate? That's my view, but...
Yeah, and from a technical team perspective, I've heard that a lot. So the Heisenberg's theory of monitoring, where why is your monitoring breaking my system? Let's turn it off and see if that thing happens again. Well, you won't know because you turned off the monitoring. So ergo, we've solved the problem.
Monitoring uncertainty principle.
Yeah, very much
Right.
so. So that helps also frame the noise debate, where we're getting alerts in the middle of the night, or the monitoring's triggering on some counter that we've never seen before, and the technical team may not necessarily even understand what that counter does or the downstream consequences of that counter. So, let's take an Exchange mail server, for example. Out of the box, a tool like SolarWinds will apply, several dozen different templates to it, and then be able to monitor each and all those counters. Well, a Exchange admin may not necessarily know what all those counters mean, and then when you apply those templates out of the box, all of a sudden things go red, things go yellow. Now, that may seem like noise initially, but as a monitoring professional, that provides a good segue to having that conversation with the admin. Say, hey, I don't necessarily know what this means, and you've already researched it, so you know what it means, but I think we might want to dig into this a bit more and see why the Q latency is X, and Microsoft recommends Y. So maybe we should look at it. Sure, everything's working great, email's working fine, but as a IT professional, maybe you might want to take a peek at this.
Right, and we'll talk more about specific ways to address things in a little bit, but the problem, again, is that observer bias, the Heisenberg theory, all of that. So that's from the technical standpoint.
So once the team really does buy in, and they have to discover the value, first, but then you come up against a management bias in a lot of cases that, IT is already viewed as a cost center. So this is one more cost that has to be justified, and they don't know whether it's maybe a compliance issue or CYA that's driving it. And a lot of times, it's hard for them to even understand that it's working. They may not know the technology enough, or you come at them with a whole bunch of acronyms to say, "Hey, look at my beautiful charts and graphs. I still don't get why I need this."
Yeah, and what do you have today, and how is this different, and why is it still working? And going after a bunch of best-of-breed point solutions and trying to roll those through your CFO is never going to be a winning strategy for sure.
So what's the first step in starting that conversation? I mean, you can go at it from you try to get them to read maybe or send them white papers or something else. But when you just walk into the office and kind of help them focus, what's a great way to begin that conversation with them?
Yeah, throwing a best practices document in front of a senior exec is a non-starter.
And invite them to a Scrum webinar while you're at it.
Yeah.
Right.
Or maybe SolarWinds Lab, and stop by. So that's going to be a non-starter. But achieving visibility of monitoring as a discipline within your business unit, be it at the corporate level, division level, wherever that happens to be, but get your corporate leader invested in monitoring. Raise your level of visibility. So that can happen in a variety of ways. So alerting, although noise, potentially can raise the level of visibility. At least initially, there may be a morale impact. So maybe you don't alert the end tech guys that need to go take action, but you alert yourself and report and be able to report to that executive and say, hey, here's all the issues that I found over this week period with this tool. Do we want to talk about remediating it? And what are the downstream consequences if we don't take action on it?
So you recommend just fire hosing a whole bunch of alerts at that uninitiated executive and saying, this is
Don't do this at home.
Exactly. That's what we're getting at. No, so report on it yourself, alert yourself, package it nicely. This is where PowerPoint skills come in handy. I'm sorry.
It is unfortunate to say that if you want to speak to management, you're going to have to learn their language, which apparently is PowerPoint.
Yep. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I was going to say, one thing that you mentioned that really got me was the idea of morale. When earlier we were talking, you mentioned they were like the 3 points that I think IT pros don't really glom onto in terms of the pressure points or the mental views. Morale was one. There were 2 other ones that you had mentioned that I want to make sure that we get out on the table.
So in terms of morale, do we want to dig into that just a bit more? So our typical IT guy, we're the guys in the trenches, we're the firefighters. We see ourselves with just unlimited bandwidth. The problem is, our wives may not, or the organization as a whole realizes that your time is finite.
Well, but as IT, we want to be helpful, and that drives a tendency for overcommitment. No matter how much we say, we're going to manage our time, or you walk in and say, I'm only going to spend 80% of my time fighting fires and the other 20% is going to be strategic. No. The firefighting feels good because we try to be helpful.
Absolutely. You're getting stuff done. You're managing alerts. You're managing your environment. But you may be running on a consistent treadmill, and answering alerts late in the night on a Saturday night is not how you should be spending your time. And if you find yourself in that position, you should find a way to not make that happen.
Or I was going to say, or fighting fires during the daytime and then finding that 20% of the time on the weekend to work on a PowerPoint presentation for management. That's the part that is not second nature to us.
Well, and remember, what we're talking about is that we're the monitoring expert, but we're talking about getting other teams to understand it. So as much as we appreciate those alerts and we know that they're meaningful or that they're indicative, that the other team, that other group that's getting that message at 2 o'clock in the morning, like you said, that's the morale, detractor. That's the one that kills morale because they didn't necessarily ask for it even if they asked for it.
Well, but you can always hit them up with a risk conversation, right? Because there are certain executives that respond really well to that.
And that may be a good wedge to drive the cost conversation. So when we talk about risk versus cost and being able to show the risks that you've identified in the environment, say, hey, here are these 20 things that we should be monitoring, should be alerting on, that these teams should be taking action on. And if we're okay accepting that risk, great. If not, well, here's what it's going to cost to either remediate it or provide additional monitoring so we can take some sort of proactive measures to address it.
Because then you sort of have a risk ROI factor of this is the potential damage and isn't monitoring a inexpensive way to reduce our potential cost.
Exactly. I mean, 90% of statistics are made up on the spot. So if you want to...
Okay.
So if you want to...
And you can quote them on that.
Exactly. So if you want to take a downtime, if you want to be able to quantify your downtime, say if my messaging server goes down, we're looking at $1,000 per minute of downtime. Make it up. Nobody can dispute that. And as long as you have some sort as long as you have some sort of justification behind those numbers that is halfway plausible, it will be accepted. It's order of magnitude off. That's fine. But at least you'll have a number that you can work off of and at least have the conversation as opposed to no basis to go on.
Well, I'll take a step back from the making up the numbers completely fabricated. is to say that what I've said in the past is based on what I'm seeing, it could be costing up to blank in terms of downtime or whatever. If the other team has a problem with that number, please, by all means, bring me your data. So again, the idea is that you're engaging in a conversation. It's not that you are going to have the answer immediately, but that you've started the conversation going, I think it's $100,000 a year. That's ridiculous. It's like, well, I'm looking at this much downtime based on my monitoring tools, and at this total loaded cost of staff and so on, and that's how I'm getting this number. Yeah, but you missed the fact that, good, we're now talking.
Yes, and in all seriousness, at this point, we've framed the conversation from a technical conversation into dollars, cents, business risk. And that's where your executive team is going to think about this. And that's how they're going to address these issues. So you're not going to explain to them BGP or OSPF. You're going to explain to them how downtime affects their business, their line of business, and how that translates into dollars and cents. And that's the bottom line.
I don't want to argue that. I don't want to say that if you're worried about risk that you're an old timer, but there are certain of the new kids, let's say, who may not respond to that. So what's another way to start that conversation? Could you talk about innovation or agility or?
So I think agility is a good one. So with the rise of Devops, now IT organizations are almost expected to be more agile. And certainly the larger the organization becomes, the less agile is expected to be. But your CIO is going to these conferences and hearing about continuous integration, continuous deployment, and he's going to want your organization to be able to accommodate those.
DevOps in a box. It's easy. You just buy it and turn it.
You just buy some DevOps.
It's a product I can pull off the shelf.
Right.
So you're going to progressively hear more and more of that, and your IT organization needs to be able to at least have an answer for that question. And monitoring plays, I believe, a key role in that.
Well, because the thing that's with agile environments and DevOps or any time you have automated process, that's the dream is always the thing we try to avoid is we want quality, we want QA, but we think that can never ever happen. But the key to quality assurance is actually measurement. So your monitoring systems are the ultimate Bible of the quality of the DevOps process and whether your agile processes are working as expected, because that is either providing data that says it is working or it's not. These changes are, the quality of the changes we're making are poor and it's affecting our overall service delivery, or it's not.
I couldn't have said it any better myself.
Well, and even with the DevOps conversation, what I've seen out in social media and other places is the phrase that DevOps without monitoring is a fail. So that's also when you have executives who come to you and say, yes, but we need to be agile and we're building a DevOps culture. Yes, monitoring is part and parcel of that DevOps culture. Absolutely. Okay, so I think we've done a good job of sort of framing the mindset, and we started to touch on some of the ways to address it, but I want to really start to dig in to some of the ways that people can do that. I want to really focus on the answers. We've got the problems sorted out. So I know that for a lot of our viewers, the management angle is what really is the nut to crack. They're very comfortable talking with technical teams. They're very comfortable pulling out the metrics and the statistics for the storage team or the virtualization team. But I think when they walk into what I affectionately call Mahogany Row, or Oak Avenue, and they have to start talking about
where all the white noise generators are.
Right, exactly. And yes.
Yeah, when you get a ticket, come fix the white noise generator. You're just like, oh.
Yeah.
Sir, you're gonna need an escort.
Yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. That area. So all of a sudden, there's a whole different language going on. So how do we talk to management and help them understand that monitoring is not just the checkbox for compliance, that it actually serves a purpose?
So we started down that road a few minutes ago. So one is visibility. And if you walk into Mahogany Row blind with no ammunition, it's going to go nowhere. So if you try to hand over a PO for a brand new monitoring tool, let's say to do APM on this brand new system that's going to generate a bunch of money for the organization, even though it's a sound investment, unless you can raise the visibility of monitoring as a discipline within the organization to the measurability aspect, they're not necessarily going to care.
So you can snap those individual requests into a larger story that they're aware of and feel that it's a valuable part of the organization.
Very, very much so. So, although old school, knock views, big knock boards, great way to go. Stick them outside your CIO's office. Green is good, red is bad. To the parable before about setting up a new revenue-generating application, what is what does 2 milliseconds of response time mean versus 4 milliseconds of response time? What is the dollar value of that? And can you display that in big, bold letters outside his office? Because that's going to translate into something that he cares about.
Well, especially where you have those other program owners, the point of interacting with other technical teams, where they're going to stand up a new application. If they want to get some glory for their app, it needs to be on that dashboard that lets you also start that conversation with this other team to say, yeah, would you like for us to monitor your application and include it in our dashboard? And then they will say, of course, we would love that. And that opens that channel to then be able to get some of the administrative access that you're going to need to be able to extend monitoring into something that otherwise was kind of a black box.
Yep.
And part of that conversation with the application team is, can you help me quantify this? Not only, I don't want to show whether it's up or down or good or bad or slow or whatever. We want to talk about the financial impact so that we can have that on the dashboard. It's just math, right? So I think that's always, and then when, again, the executive says, that's impossible, that doesn't cost us, well, actually, let's talk about that. So that's definitely one way to get it going. Also, we talked about understanding how monitoring fits into the organization, and why wasn't what I had before doing it now. I think there's a case to be made for what I call a feature function matrix, but it's a list of, here's all of the tools that we have, here's all the features that we need done, here are the gaps, here's the overlaps. And my question is whether that's compelling to management, or if that's just my own, technical checklist. Like, do I have all my bases covered?
No, I think that's entirely valuable, because as everyone knows well, when they walk in to ask for money, the first thing they're going to hear is, well, what do we have today and why isn't it working? And then the second question is going to be, how does this overlap with the tools we have today, and being able to justify that overlap. So,
what can you get rid of to fund this?
Yeah, but precisely.
Brick in, brick out.
But very much so. So I think something like that is entirely valuable to frame the conversation, and then it goes from technical, which is the Venn diagram of overlap, into the dollars and cents, and what does this actually mean from a positive perspective of the organization.
Great. I think that there's an opportunity right now, and we started to edge into it with DevOps, but I think there's an opportunity right now to frame the conversation about monitoring, because it's actually not all the same. You mentioned before, Patrick, about old timers. I don't think it's old timers anymore. I think that the landscape has been
just
changing.
Conservative.
Well,
right? Like if you're IT for a financial services company, you might be a very young person with a lot of great ideas and energy and excitement about new technology and clean sheet re-implementation, and you want to start down that path. But the requirements of the business are going to make you operate in a little bit more traditional manner.
Right. But with all of that said, I think that the nature of what we're seeing in technology allows you to go in with it's not same old business. I don't know if that...
The landscape certainly is changing. I mean, obviously, the technology refresh cycle, let's say 2 years max. So what's old is new again, potentially, in the mainframe world. And those problems aren't going to go away. So you could be a burgeoning young professional that does have a slightly more conservative, we won't say stodgy, environment, that does have compliance concerns, change management. These things aren't going to go away. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the hot young startup web-based application, containerization, where APM is going to be a bit more important than monitoring your ZOS. And somewhere in between, there's the traditional enterprise. And that I would say that is actually shifting more towards the hot startup agility in terms of continuous integration, continuous deployment. And the paradigms, not to abuse a phrase, of monitoring are shifting.
Do you find that it's easier in some cases to start that conversation if an IT executive comes to you and they just got back from a conference or read some blog article about the hot new thing, and they're like, hey, we've heard this thing cloud is really great, it's going to save us a ton of money, or we're going to move everything to Salesforce and I'm sure it's going to be just fine, we don't need to upgrade our internet connections. Is that a chance to take their enthusiasm for technology and steer it back to, yes, but you still have this huge investment in infrastructure
Absolutely.
to take care of?
So I call that the squirrel theorem.
Okay.
So that squirrel,
right?
so harness that energy. Subscribe to CIO Quarterly. I mean, they have an application that you can put on your phone if you don't read magazines. So read what your leadership does. So you can be prepared to have those conversations ahead of the leader driving it. So you can actually proactively go to them and say, "Hey, how was Microsoft Ignite? Anything interesting there? By the way, there's these few things I'd like to talk to you about that may be of interest to our organization."
How did you know I went to Ignite? I read your email. Oops. Yeah, but you can also do little things like send them a link every now and then, right? To let them know that you're looking at the same sorts of things that they are, to assume that you are in the mood to have those kind of conversations and you're not just down there doing all that technical stuff, whatever it is that you do.
Absolutely. So you can be seen as a business leader and a force within the organization as opposed to the guy that sends alerts out and wakes people up out of bed.
Right, and at least business interested. And I think that's another message that we've gotten over the course of these types of conversations is that no one's asking the IT pro, the monitoring engineer, to suddenly be interested in ROI and EBITDA and all those financial terms. Like nobody wants that. But understanding that the business drivers and being visibly engaged in those things, understanding that the stability is more important at end of month when there's closings, or this application which runs hot in the middle of the month. You've got the data to actually know that, and being sensitive to it shows that you are sensitive to the business without having to make the transition to the dark side and get into management or something like that.
But along those lines, having all the data does put you in the catbird seat to have that conversation, since many of the other technical teams in the organization may not. So IT is generally seen as a cost center, obviously, but by having the data, it enables you to potentially have the conversation of translating into revenue generation. So IT as a service, being able to do chargeback, being able to do showback, all that's impossible in the absence of having the data. So as we see IT organizations progress, that's, I don't want to say the holy grail, but maybe the next step in the evolution of IT departments where it's seen as an internal service. So obviously cloud adoption is ramping rapidly. So being able to position yourself as internal IT, getting ahead of that and saying, okay, well, AWS is interesting to us, and here's what it would cost if we were to transition these services, but internally we can quantify what it costs us today and then be able to show the cost savings over time. So having the data is critical for that.
That's a really interesting point, because if you think about it, if you don't have the data, you're at a disadvantage to all of the other portions of the organization, right? Marketing, sales, operations, facilities, production, any of those other parts of the business are going to be generating piles and piles of data to measure their effectiveness. And if you can't come to those same meetings, if your executives don't go to their e-staff meetings armed with the same types of data for IT, they're automatically going to have a squishy feeling about what it is that you do.
And by data, we don't necessarily just mean ICMP reachability, right?
No.
But let's do.
It needs to be rolled up and aggregated a little bit more than that with some trends.
Well, one might say so. Just ping status, not going to cut it in this day and age. So being able to look at monitoring from a service delivery perspective. So it's interesting that the web server is up, but is it actually delivering the application to the end users? Mm-hmm. And what does their experience look like? Response time translates into dollars in this day and age.
Well, and remember, you as IT have numbers that nobody else has access to. Yeah. You knew when you added or removed hardware. You have an eye on capacity. You knew when your spend hit the budget. So with a little bit of research, you can do things like show capacity planning, actual capacity, and performance charted together. So you can say this investment actually resulted in improvement, and here's an area where maybe we had a leaner quarter and we pushed off a purchase and watched our performance for an application actually decline and then expand back up again with investment. So you can kind of show that continuous investment results in improved performance.
And to that end, we're talking about going to the business armed with data to justify purchases. The feedback loop there is also equally important, to be able to close the loop and say, hey, we made this investment in monitoring hardware, whatever the case may be, and here's what we forecast it was going to result in. How did we do? How accurate were we? And that will buy you credence going to executives later on to be able to justify a future purchase. Well, we were accurate the past 2 times. What makes us think we're not going to be accurate now?
So is it frustrating when you're in the exec seat of you get constant requests for hardware or for services? You're writing a lot of checks, and then something just kind of goes off and you never get any feedback of whether that was no one's first going to say, come and say, thanks, that was great, really appreciate it. But it's got to be really frustrating if you're not getting that feedback loop to say, I am continually investing in this thing and I never hear anything back. And monitoring is a great way to prove the value of those checks.
Yeah, it's a direct feedback loop. So I cut a check. What does it buy me? Was it implemented? How are we using it? Did we get out of it what we thought we were going to get out of it? And by monitoring, having that visibility into the infrastructure and providing that feedback loop of the infrastructure to management, it's a perfect.
I was going to say, just to close that thought off, the other nice thing is it gives you a chance to show up and say, hey, boss, thanks so much for supporting our infrastructure. And you actually, instead of always being the apologist or always being the one called on the carpet when something breaks that you had no responsibility for, they were working with a front loader out in the yard,
backhoe event.
back throw, through.
Bringing the guy, yell at again.
Well, you get to now start showing up and saying, hey, thank you so much for this. Appreciate it. By the way, here's the upside for the organization.
Well, the other thing that I think a lot of times IT pros miss is that when you're reporting up to management, even C-level executives, they want to be able to go tell other people about this thing. Hey, my staff here told me this was a really good investment. I believe them because they're my staff, and I really love their technical expertise. And we went with it, we did it, and here's what the result is. They want to be able to talk about it either to their upper management or to their to the rest of the crew, because that's a morale booster.
And to that end, a really great data set, if you can get it, is let's say a baseline of data from other organizations that may be in your particular vertical. So if you can get that data for your boss, you will be golden to be able to say, here's how we look from an adoption perspective compared to other financial services companies, or here's how we look for web response time compared to other health providers, whatever the case may be. So he can take those kind of meta level metrics and socialize them with his peers. So when he does go to those see whatever meetings, he can say, well, Jim, looks like your response time's a little slow this week. What's going on? And gives him some ammunition when he's talking to his peers.
Yeah, that's always popular. But shiny and new, always a good thing to talk about, right? So what are you seeing in terms of trends now? We've talked about for our customers, they're increasingly having a challenge with managing hybrid IT environments. What are you seeing really changing from the executive side in IT, let's say over the next 12 to 18 months?
Well, I think that the tide has shifted with DevOps and hybrid IT, and that's no longer on the horizon. That's a here now. So when we talk about that spectrum of organizations, the middle part of the bell curve right now is trying to figure out what hybrid IT means to them. Various disciplines in the business may be working outside of IT. It's so-called shadow IT organization, just spinning up services that may be SaaS. They may actually be platforms. So you may have marketing going off, spinning up AWS instances. That never happens. That's a terrifying thought. But if IT isn't seen as a driver of the business, or at least an enabler, you will see that behavior occur more and more. So that's something to watch for.
And it seems like understanding that parts of the business have the wherewithal, they have the budget and whatever to suddenly spin up their own whatever it is system on AWS or Azure or what have you. Being prepared for that means that you say, my monitoring tools, because of course we're here to talk about monitoring, my monitoring tools are ready to address that, are ready to fill in that gap. They don't have to go off into the wild in that shadow IT method, and that way you socialize that.
Yep.
So is that an opportunity to start a conversation? Like, give you an example. Marketing, you gave the example before, in particular, likes to find new solutions based on something that they have heard or can prove has worked for other organizations. And a lot of those times they're SaaS. It's not even I'm going to stand up AWS or Azure instances and build it myself. I'm just going to subscribe to the SaaS service. So now you have moved mission critical services to a SaaS provider. You need to assure that that's working for the business, but that person may not even know that they need to have monitoring on that service to make sure that it's going to work. So is there an opportunity to propose that as a way of managing that random IT spend, or people who are going off and investing in services and not talking about it? Because that's the risk to the CIO.
Yeah, it's a good foothold to have the conversation. So certainly IT is going to be the one that's going to get the call if there's an issue with that service. Whether or not you can affect change is a different story, but you're going to get the call. So pivoting that into a monitoring conversation, saying, is this provider living up to their SLAs, so we can at least go after them? And by the way, in order for me to have full visibility, I need some credentials, administrative credentials for this application so I can sign into it, be able to come up with scripts to pull metrics out of it, whatever the case may be. So I think it's a good segue into having that conversation.
So to address the risk or their concern about risk, you can say, hey, I know you're worried about these things. If someone adopts a service, I can monitor it. Just send them to me and I'll take care of it.
Yes, the leader in your organization is going to be much more comfortable if you were able to go to them preemptively and say, don't worry, we're already set up with X, Y, and Z to handle this when marketing comes to us with its request versus getting hit sideways in a meeting where you're just not prepared.
And they're the ones that are going to have access to that shadow IT. They are going to be aware of that shadow IT purchase because they're in the meetings where that was funded, but you and IT may not know anything about it.
Right, and this is a good place to start to dovetail into the second half, which is, we've talked about addressing management's concerns or helping management become more aware of how monitoring matters to the business. But what we're speaking to here is a level of confidence that external teams, whether it's marketing or storage or what have you, making it our monitoring, making us matter to them so that they're not ignoring it, they're not, that they are coming to us and saying, hey, I really need this capability. Could be a SaaS, could be a hybrid answer. I need this capability. What can you do to help me make sure that it's reliable and stable? Coming to us first. So let's talk about that. And I'm going to just start off an idea, which is I see a lot of IT pros, a lot of monitoring professionals jump in and they turn on the whole solution. And we talked about this before. There's that fire hose of alerts. And they're relatively generic. They don't really,
monitor all the things.
Monitor all the things, alert all the things all the time. And I would caution that you want to deal with that stuff one alert at a time. Just start with one and say, how'd that work for you? So that's the first thing.
How did it work for you? How do you want to consume it? What sort of notification is effective?
Right.
What kind of triage is working for you?
Right. And you mentioned this earlier, and I just want to reemphasize it. You said, don't send the alert to them first.
Yeah, you definitely don't want to alert the end practitioner right out of the gate. In fact, that will do nothing but assure a rift between the teams. So when you're testing alerts, when you're testing new technology, whatever the case may be, alert yourself first. Be able to maybe even report ahead of that for issues, and then have the conversation during normal business hours. Maybe informal, maybe structured. Here's the things I found. It's not accusatory. It's just, here's what's going on with the environment. Should I be concerned about these things? Should you be concerned about these things? I don't know. But I do know because I researched it ahead of having this conversation. Mm-hmm. And it helps you break down the silos between technical disciplines and provides you more visibility and more credence as a monitoring professional.
Right. So that's, and I also think that when you come to them and say, they were up at 2 o'clock in the morning because the system failed. You know that because you got the alert, okay? But you didn't, you didn't send them the alert first because they don't know it. But I have had wonderful conversations where they said, where did you get that? Mm-hmm. Like, where are you getting that information from? Oh, well, I have the system that I'm doing for my own stuff or my whatever it is, and I just happened to see that, really? Could you have some of that stuff for me?
Well, and you said something the other day that was interesting about having the wrong data sometimes is a great start because it at least facilitates that conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. So, even if the data you're pulling happens to be incorrect, it's the wrong SNMP counter because the template was wrong or whatever the case may be, it at least opens that door. Mm-hmm. And you can go to them and say, hey, I see fan speed on this is 0. That seems odd. Well, no, actually, it's working just fine. Okay, well, let's dig in from a technical perspective. You find out, the firmware on this thing is different or whatever the case may be. It ingratiates you with that team, mm-hmm. Starts to break down those silos, and then moreover, starts to establish your monitoring system as kind of the system of record. Right. So you're able to look across silos, across teams, between storage, database, networking systems, and you become the system of record. If it exists, it should exist in monitoring, and people start to come to you for monitoring requests, data requests.
Right. And there's also the, hey, I noticed that the fan speed was 0. Wait, you can get fan speed? Wait a minute. What else can you see?
I have a whole lot of other things I'd like for you to see.
If you can get that, maybe you can, they didn't even realize that metric was possible to be collected. I also see that wrong number. It doesn't have to be inaccurate. It can be the wrong one. And we talk a lot on lab about this, that in Linux, there's 2 different ways to calculate RAM. And, there's the one way that is built into a lot of systems, and there's the other way that a lot of sysadmins want. Coming to them and saying, this is the RAM value. Oh, that's the wrong one. Oh, do you want me to switch it? because I can switch it. As long as your tools are able to, to pivot like that, to be flexible. Again, I think that starts the conversation technically.
Yeah, and if you want that fix, vote it up on THWACK.
Right. And there's some templates, and right, exactly. Thank you. Gone but haven't forgotten. That's great.
So we talked about something the other day, and that was how much executives just love receiving lots and lots and lots and lots of help desk tickets. Wherever possible, don't use any automation. Don't use your monitoring to streamline your processes.
Again, don't try this.
Instead of having 10 people, you don't have 2 help desk specialists, have 10. That's much, much better.
Yeah, hire lots of eyeballs.
Yeah. No, that automated actions are kind of important.
So in terms of, let's say, automated remediation, so yes, obviously another value that you as a monitoring professional can provide to the organization. Let's say something goes bump in the middle of the night and you can automatically reboot a server. Or moreover, alert a different team, if you're able to scale horizontally, that can take care of that in the middle of the night. That doesn't necessarily need to be your tier 3 person. So yeah, there's plenty of ways that you as a monitoring professional with a properly configured alert infrastructure can save a bunch of money.
So what else can you automate? Baselining?
Oh, baselining. Well, and not just baselining. Baselining is great for squelching the alerts, right? To prevent those things that go bump in the middle of the night from going bump in the middle of the night. But also from a capacity perspective, to be able to alert proactively on things that will become a problem. So you can alert during normal business hours about this thing that will become a problem in a week from now, whatever the case may be. And being able to report on those instances and being able to show that back to the organization, say, here's what we prevented in terms of, let's say, downtime. Because remember what happened last time this occurred? It cost us X amount of money. And that's very tangible to the leaders in IT.
And I think that that's important as monitoring professionals to understand the difference and to help your consumers, once you've engaged them, understand the difference between an alert and a report and a screen. And I think a lot of times everyone goes straight to the ticket because that's the trackable thing. But making sure people understand, I can tell you at 2 o'clock in the morning when it broke, but I can tell you at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on every Thursday where it's at so that you avoid that 2 o'clock in the morning, because you've gotten the report to know what's going on.
So I was going to say, there's one thing that we definitely want to, before we wrap up, we want to get to, and that is a big don't, which is, it goes to the fear that a lot of people in IT have, which is do not suggest monitoring for a second is going to replace their management tools. Yeah. Because a lot of times they would, and they should, push back on that because the management tools are working at managing infrastructure. They actually work together.
Yeah, I'd say that's absolutely true, particularly as you're trying to ingratiate yourself in the various silos that exist technically in your organization. They have their own tools. They have their own vendor tools that they use to great effect to be able to affect change on various devices. Right. You're not going to replace that. And if those tools had the built-in monitoring capabilities that you have on your side, well, they wouldn't need that. But however, it's a heterogeneous environment, and you need those solutions.
Yeah, and it's even if their management tools have monitoring, that's a sanity check. The management tools give them the forensics, the deep dive, the more intensive scrutiny, and not only that it shouldn't replace it, but you want to make it clear that you have no intention of replacing it.
Well, it's also showing them how to use those tools more effectively, right? Because it's showing whether the quality of the changes that are made by those tools much more quickly and comprehensively than if you have to do it manually.
And we talked earlier about single pane of glass, that not only with their management tools they're seeing that particular area, with a good sophisticated monitoring tool they're seeing not only that but the impact from other areas. So I just want to wrap up by pointing out that at the beginning of the session I talked about how monitoring is seen as noise and how it's viewed as an interruption or possibly a disruption. When done right, and I've seen this, and it's wonderful, that monitoring goes from a do we have to, that teams are like, if I have to install, if I have to enable that, fine, to the teams coming back and saying, your high availability, your disaster recovery level in our corporate structure isn't high enough.
They get to where they can't live without it.
Yeah, they absolutely, you need to bring it up. And that is the most, even though it's a little bit of a challenge for monitoring professionals, like how do I make this HA, how do I whatever, that is a compliment. And it means that you've done all of what you're talking about right.
Very much so. I mean, monitoring is not a destination, it's a journey. And if done appropriately, you're going to get to the point where something really obscure is going to go bump in the middle of the night, somebody's going to come to you and say, why weren't we monitoring that? And that's actually a really great place to be because it means you covered all your bases and now you're just chopping down that long tail of issues to go monitor. You'll never be done.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining us.
It's been an absolute pleasure, gentlemen.
It was great having you, and we hope you enjoyed this session. Please keep your feedback coming.